The Redhead was locked in the barn as cursed. A sheriff kicked the door down. The padlock was a cheap one. I remember that. Pressed-in casing, the kind you'd find in a general store bin for 15 cents, the kind a man buys when he wants to say he's locked something up without actually believing it needs to stay locked. I stood in the dark outside that barn and looked at it hanging there on the latch, and I thought, whoever put this on didn't think she'd try to get out. They thought she'd just accept it. I was 53 years old, and I had been the sheriff of Garnet Creek for 11 years. In that time, I'd broken up 3 range wars, sent 14 men to the territorial prison at Yuma, buried 6 deputies, and watched the town I'd given those years to become something I wouldn't have recognized if I'd ridden in as a stranger. Some towns do that. Start decent and slowly fill up with something else, like a clean, well-going sour from the inside, and you keep drawing water for so long you don't notice the taste has changed, until one day you hold the bucket up to the light. That night I noticed. I'll start where it actually starts, which isn't the barn. It's the previous Tuesday mid-morning when Amos Pratt came into my office with a petition, 43 names on it, men I knew. Men I'd had dinner with, played cards with, pulled out of ditches when their horses threw them in a storm. Amos laid that paper on my desk like he was setting down something holy, and he said, "Sheriff Cade, we need you to formalize the situation regarding the Halloran woman." I looked at the paper, then I looked at him. The Halloran woman was Nora Halloran. She'd come into Garnet Creek 8 months before on the mail stage from Tucson, carrying 1 trunk and a letter of introduction to Elias Doyle at the land office. She was from County Cork originally, been in the Arizona territory long enough to lose most of the brogue but not the temper, and she had hair the color of a new penny in sunlight, the kind of red that people in that country called remarkable, because they'd never seen anything exactly like it. She'd taken work as a seamstress, renting the back room of Millie Pogg's dress shop, and she was quiet and kept herself to herself, and nobody had a word against her for the first 6 months. Then Chester Rudd's barn burned down. Nobody saw what started it. Chester said he saw Nora walking the road near his property that afternoon, which was true enough. She walked that road every Wednesday to collect fabric from the Calvert farm. Chester didn't say she'd done anything, just that he'd seen her. But Chester's wife Dora had never liked the look of Nora, something about the eyes, she said, too direct, and Dora talked to Constance Pratt, and Constance talked to her sister-in-law. And by the time the story had made 3 or 4 circles through the women's sewing circles and the men's card games, it had grown into something that didn't resemble what Chester had actually said. The word that started circulating, and I mean this literally, I heard it from 4 different mouths in 1 week, was cursed. I'd heard some foolishness in my years. That word from grown people in the year of our Lord 1887 was a particular kind of foolishness that made me tired in a way I couldn't quite put into words. But I'd said my piece about it privately to Amos and to Reverend Hatch, and they'd nodded and said of course, and then gone right on believing what they believed, the way men will. Then Jacob Foote's youngest boy fell off a horse and broke his wrist. The boy had been showing off for his friends and riding without his hands, which any man who'd ever been 9 years old could have told you was going to end a specific way. But Nora had been at the Foote place the week before, taking a dress measurement for Jacob's wife. And so there it was again. Then the Pratt well went foul. I'd looked at that well myself, dead coyote at the bottom of it. Animal had fallen in and drowned. It happens. But Amos Pratt had made up his mind, and a man who has made up his mind cannot be unlocked with evidence. He's latched from the inside. So there was the petition on my desk. The petition said, in language that Amos was proud of and which I suspected Reverend Hatch had helped him write, that the presence of Nora Halloran within the town limits of Garnet Creek was a source of distress to the community, and that the sheriff was requested, in his official capacity, to remove said presence to a location outside the town proper, until such time as the community could determine the appropriate course of action. I read it twice. Then I said no. Amos blinked. He said, "Sheriff, there are 43 names on that." I said, "There are 211 people in this town, Amos, and 43 of them have lost their minds. But that doesn't make it an official majority." He said, "Sheriff Cade, if you won't act on this, the community may feel compelled to act itself." I looked at him a long time. Amos Pratt was not a bad man. That was the thing that wore on me most. He was not a bad man, not in any of the ways that make a man easy to oppose. He'd helped me carry lumber for the schoolhouse. He donated cattle to the widow Beecham when her husband died. He believed what he believed with his whole ordinary heart, and he could not see the shape of what it was making him. I said, "Amos, if anyone in this town puts a hand on that woman, I will arrest them and they will stand before Judge Calloway and explain to him, in a court of law, what the legal basis was for their action. You take that back to your 43 names." He left. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong, which I should have known. I'd been wrong about this town before. 4 days after Amos Pratt walked out of my office, I rode out to the Calvert place to look at a disputed fence line, and I was gone most of the day. When I came back into town at dusk, something was off. I could feel it before I could see it, the way a man feels weather before the cloud comes over the ridge, a particular stillness on the street, lamps lit behind curtains. Nobody out front of the saloon, which on a Thursday evening should have had 3 or 4 men on the steps. I rode to Millie Pogg's dress shop. The back room where Nora Halloran lived was dark. The door was standing open. I knocked on Millie's door. Millie opened it about 4 inches and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, a combination of guilt and something I can only call relief, like she was glad I was there so that the thing that had happened was now my problem and not hers. I said, "Where is she, Millie?" Millie said, "I didn't have any part in it, Wade. You should know that." I said, "Where?" She said they'd taken her to the Rudd barn, Chester Rudd's rebuilt barn, out on the eastern edge of town. She said Amos had organized it, him and the Foote brothers and maybe 7 or 8 others, and they'd come in the afternoon while she was out, and they'd gone into Nora's room and told her she needed to come with them. And when she'd refused, and Millie's voice went tight here, and I saw her jaw move, when she'd refused, they'd taken her by the arms and walked her out. I sat in the saddle and I looked at Millie Pogg, and I felt something go very cold and very still inside me. Not angry, not yet, just cold. The kind of cold that settles in when you have been doing a job for 11 years and you find out the job has been quietly failing without your knowledge. I said, "Anyone hurt her?" Millie said, "Not that I saw." I rode to the Rudd barn. There were 3 men outside it. Jacob Foote and his older brother Clement, and a younger man whose name I didn't know, maybe a farmhand or a drifter they'd recruited for the occasion. They had a fire going in a ring of stones about 20 feet from the barn door, and they were sitting around it in the way men sit around fires when they're trying to look like what they're doing is ordinary. Jacob stood up when he saw me come out of the dark. He said, "Sheriff." I swung down from my horse. I said, "Open that barn." Jacob said, "Sheriff Cade, the community has made a decision." I said, "Jacob, open the barn or step aside and I will." Clement said something about the community's right to protect itself. I walked past him to the barn door. The padlock was on the latch. I looked at it. Cheap press tin. I pulled my boot back and I kicked it. Not the padlock. The latch bracket it was hanging on, which was screwed into old wood, and it came off the door in one piece, bracket and lock and all, and fell in the dirt. I pulled the door open. The inside of the barn was dark, hay and horse-dung smell, a couple of Chester's horses moving in their stalls, nervous from the noise. There was a lantern hung on a post near the door, and I took it down and raised it. She was sitting on a hay bale in the far corner, not cowering, sitting straight-backed with her hands in her lap and her chin up, and in the lantern light her hair was extraordinary, that deep red copper going almost amber at the edges, and her eyes when she found my face were green and absolutely steady. She looked at me the way a person looks when they have decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them afraid. I said, "Miss Halloran, I'm Sheriff Cade. I apologize for what's been done to you tonight, and I'm going to get you out of here." She said, "You're the third person who's come through that door tonight, Sheriff. The first two were not as friendly." Her voice was even, cork undertone, like I said, mostly worn away, but steady. I remember that, how steady. I said, "Can you walk?" She said, "I can walk, ride, rope a calf, and throw a man twice my size if he's not expecting it. I'm not hurt." I held the lantern for her to get up, and I walked her out. Jacob Foote started to say something, and I turned and looked at him, and he stopped. I helped her onto my horse. She moved like a woman who knew horses, no hesitation, and I walked us out of the yard and down the road, leading the horse by the bridle. Behind us I heard the Foote brothers talking low, and I heard my name, and I heard other words I'll not repeat here, but none of them followed us. I didn't take her back to Millie Pogg's. That was over. I took her to the jailhouse, which had a small room in the back used for witnesses and for women prisoners. A room with a cot and a wash basin and a bolt on the inside of the door, on the inside, you understand, which matters. And I settled her in there, and I told her she was under my protection, and nobody was coming through that door without going through me first. She stood in the middle of the room with the lantern I'd put on the table, and she looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" I said, "Because it's my job." She said, "It's also your job to enforce what the community decides," and what they decided tonight was. I said, "The community can decide a lot of things. Can't decide to lock a woman in a barn because her hair is the wrong color and a coyote fell in a well." She looked at me. She said, "That's what Amos Pratt told you, a coyote." I said, "That's what I found when I looked in the well." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. She sat on the edge of the cot and put her hands flat on her knees and took a breath. She said, "What happens tomorrow?" I said, "Tomorrow I go see Amos Pratt, and I go see Reverend Hatch, and I go see Chester Rudd, and I tell each one of them what the legal position is regarding false imprisonment, which is what occurred tonight. And then we go from there." She said, "And if they don't listen?" I said, "Then the next step is a letter to the territorial judge, but I think they'll listen." She said, "You've known these men a long time." I said, 11 years. She said, "And you're willing to put that against them, for someone you don't know?" I didn't answer that right away, because the honest answer was complicated. It wasn't only for her, though she deserved it as much as anyone deserved the law working in their direction for once. It was also because of what Amos Pratt had said to me in my office. If you won't act, the community may feel compelled, and because of the 43 names on that paper, and because of the look on Millie Pogg's face, a woman I'd known for a decade, when she'd said I didn't have any part in it, like she was talking herself into believing it. Because something was happening to this town, and if I didn't hold the line here tonight, with this woman and this barn and this ridiculous padlock, I would not recognize what I'd have let it become. I said, "I've been sheriff of Garnet Creek for 11 years. I intend to be able to look at myself in the morning. Good night, Miss Halloran." I went out and shut the door, and I heard her put the bolt across. I sat at my desk for a long time, drank bad coffee, and listened to the town settle into night quiet, the saloon sounds bleeding off, the last horse going by on the street, the lamp across the way in the hotel going dark. Sat and thought about what I'd done and whether it had been wise, and decided that wisdom wasn't really the point. Some things you do because they're right, and then afterward you figure out how to survive the consequences. The morning was hard. Amos Pratt came in at 7, Reverend Hatch with him, and I laid out the legal position clearly. Hatch was more shaken than I expected. I think he'd believed what he'd preached, but he'd also not quite let himself picture it all the way through, the actual woman in the actual barn, and when I described it plain, something in his face changed. He was not a bad man either. Not one of them was. That was the thing I kept coming back to. I told them, the next man who puts a hand on Nora Halloran will be arrested and held for the circuit judge, and I will recommend maximum penalty for false imprisonment. I told them, if anyone interferes with her property, her dwelling, her livelihood, or her person, it is a criminal matter. I told them, I understand their fears, I don't share them, and it is not in their interest to put this in front of a judge who will not share them either. By the end, Amos looked tired and Hatch looked embarrassed, and I walked them out and watched them go down the street. Then I went back to the witness room and knocked and said it was me, and Nora Halloran unbolted the door. In the daylight she looked both more and less than she had the night before. Less, more ordinary, no amber lantern light making her hair burn the way it had, and more, because I could see her clearly. She was maybe 35, 36, strong jaw, freckled across the nose in a way that the territory sun had brought out. The green eyes still steady, but with tiredness in them now that the night had let her feel it. She said, "What's the verdict?" I said, "You're safe. For now. I'd like it if you'd consider staying close to town center for a few days, not because you've done anything wrong, but because I'd rather have you where I can see things." She said, "I'm not a prisoner." I said, "No, you're not. You can walk out of this building and go wherever you choose, and I'll do my best to make sure nothing happens to you wherever that is. I'm asking, not ordering." She looked at me a moment, then she said, "All right, for a few days." I found her somewhere to stay, old Dorothea Wills, a widow who lived alone in a house with 2 spare rooms and who was one of the 43 names not on that petition. Bless her. Nora moved in that afternoon. I checked on her the first couple of days, not obviously, not in a way that would embarrass her or make the watching a thing she had to acknowledge. Just to pass by the Wills' house in the evening, making sure things were quiet. She saw me each time, of course she did. On the 3rd evening she was sitting on the porch steps when I came by, and she said, "Sheriff Cade, if you're going to look in on me, you might as well sit down." So I sat on the porch steps of Dorothea Wills' house in the early dark, and Nora Halloran and I talked for about an hour. She told me about Cork, about her mother who'd been a lace maker and her father who'd worked the fishing boats until his hands gave out. She'd come to America at 19 with an aunt who hadn't survived the crossing. She'd made her way. She'd been in Denver, in Santa Fe, in Tucson. She'd married once, young, a man named Patrick Halloran, and he'd died of fever in New Mexico 2 years into it, and she'd kept his name because it was hers now as much as his. She asked me about my life. I'm not a man who talks about himself easily, but she asked in a way that made it feel like a reasonable thing, not prying. I told her about growing up in Tennessee, about coming west at 22 because there'd been nothing left for me after the war, about getting the deputy job in Garnet Creek almost by accident when the previous sheriff died and nobody else wanted it, about the 11 years. She said, "You sound like a man who chose his work over everything else." I said maybe work was what was there. She looked out at the road for a moment. The sky had gone dark blue, not black yet, the first stars showing. She said, "Is it enough?" I didn't answer that. I said goodnight and walked back to the office. But the question stayed with me, the way questions do when they've found the exact right tender spot. The week that followed was a careful one. I made it my business to be visible, ate my meals at the hotel restaurant instead of cooking at my desk, walked the main street at regular hours, stopped in at the barber shop and the general store, and said hello to people I knew. The kind of presence that reminds a town that the law is a material thing, not just a concept. Amos Pratt avoided my eye for several days, which was fine. Clement Foote crossed the street when he saw me coming, which was also fine. Reverend Hatch actually came to me after Sunday service and said, quietly, that he'd been doing some reflecting. I said I was glad to hear it and let it go at that. There was a particular afternoon that week, Thursday, a slow day, the kind of day when a frontier town seems to be holding its breath between events, when I sat in my office and did nothing useful for about an hour. just sat and looked at the deputy's desk, which had been empty since Ernesto's predecessor, a man named Lou Garvey, had ridden out to check on a complaint and not come back, which was the kind of thing you carry and don't talk about. I sat and I thought about the 11 years. What they'd cost and what they'd built. The 6 deputies' names that I still said to myself sometimes in the morning, in order, like a habit of prayer. The men I'd sent to Yuma, some of whom had deserved it, and some of whom had mostly needed someone to redirect them before they hit the point of no return, which I hadn't always been able to manage. The fence lines I'd mediated, the cattle disputes, the water rights arguments that had once come within a day of becoming a range war, and which I'd walked back by sitting at a table with 2 stubborn men for 6 hours until they ran out of intractable positions. All of that, 11 years of it, and then a woman with red hair locked in a barn with a 15-cent padlock, and me standing outside it at midnight, and the question of whether I'd kick the door. I had kicked the door. I hadn't thought twice about it. The thinking came later, as it usually does, after the action has already declared itself. There was a Mexican rancher I'd known years back, early in my tenure, a man named Fortunato Reyes who ran cattle south of town, and who'd become something like a friend in the way that men can be friends across the business of shared work and shared respect. Fortunato had a saying he'd offer sometimes when something went sideways that he hadn't expected. The body knows before the mind, he'd say. The body already has the answer. You just have to get the thinking out of the way. He died of pneumonia 4 winters back, and I thought of him sometimes. I thought of him that Thursday afternoon. The body knew it was wrong, what they'd done. The body was already at the door, before the mind had finished drafting the arguments. Nora Halloran went back to work. Millie Pogg, to her credit, came to Dorothea Will's house herself to ask Nora if she'd return to the dress shop. I heard about this secondhand from Dorothea, who told it to me with some satisfaction. Nora had said she'd think about it, and she had thought about it, and she'd gone back. She sewed. She walked to the Calvert place on Wednesdays. She was polite to the women who had been polite to her, and she was civil to the ones who hadn't, and she didn't make it any more of a thing than it was, which I thought took more discipline than most people would have had. We talked most evenings, when I made my last round. It got to be a habit without either of us deciding it was one. I'd come by the Wills' house around 8 and she'd be on the porch if the weather was decent, and we'd sit for a while. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers in a way that was different from most listening, like she was actually taking a thing in and turning it over, not just waiting for her turn. I found myself saying things I hadn't said to anyone in years, about the deputies I'd buried, about what the town had meant to me and what it meant now, about the gap between those 2 things. One evening she asked me about Tennessee, what I'd left behind there. It was the kind of question that had a short answer and a long answer, and most people only wanted the short one, so I gave the short one at first. Family gone, war gone, nothing to stay for. She looked at me from her end of the porch steps and didn't say anything, which was the right move, and after a moment I gave her more of it. A father who'd worked himself to death on 30 acres of bad land. A younger brother who died at 19 in a battle that nobody remembers now. One of the 100 small ones that happened in the last 6 months that didn't have names in the papers, because the papers were tired of the war by then. A woman I'd thought I might marry who'd married a man with a hardware store while I was gone, which I'd understood and held nothing against, but which had settled something in me about how far I was going from where I'd started. She said, "And you came west and you became this." I said, "I became this." She said, "Do you think you would have been this in Tennessee, this kind of man?" I said, "I don't know, different things make you, different ground." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. Then she said, "I think you would have been something like it. The ground doesn't make you from nothing. It just brings out what's already in." I didn't respond to that. But I turned it over later, in the office, in the way you turn over something a person says that you don't quite know what to do with but that you don't want to lose. She said one evening, "You're not angry at them. That's what I couldn't understand at first. You're not angry." I said I was, early on, when I was younger. Then I got tired of it, and somewhere in that tiredness I got, I don't know, practical maybe. She said, "Practical?" I said, "They're afraid. People who are afraid do what people do when they're afraid. I don't have to like it. I have to figure out what to do about it." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You're a particular kind of man, Sheriff Cade." I said, "What kind is that?" She said, "The kind that's more useful than he is appreciated." There was nothing I could say to that. So I said good night and walked home, and the stars were out over the street, and I was 53 years old, and I could feel the question she'd asked me a week before still sitting in its place where it had lodged. Is it enough? It was about 3 weeks after the barn that the trouble came back, and it came back harder. What happened was simple and ugly. One of the farmhands who'd been outside the Rudd barn that night, the young one whose name I hadn't known, I'd since learned was called Dix. No last name anyone seemed sure of. Dix had been in a card game at the saloon, and he'd gotten into it with a man over a hand of cards, the way men do. And he'd said something loud enough for the room to hear about how even the sheriff wasn't man enough to handle what needed handling with the cork witch, and that maybe the men of Garnet Creek ought to remedy that. My deputy, a good young man named Ernesto Garay, had heard it and come straight to me. I went to the saloon. I found Dix at the bar, and I told him that he'd made a public threat against a resident of this town, and that if he was still inside the town limits of Garnet Creek in 1 hour I would arrest him and hold him for the territorial court. He looked at me, and he looked at the room, and he made his calculation, and he left. But the room had heard it, and some of the room agreed with him, or at least didn't strongly disagree, which is its own kind of agreement. I could see it in the way men moved, the way certain conversations stopped when I walked past. A mood had gotten into the town, and I'd driven it underground but not out. The days between the posting of the judge's notice and the saloon incident had been almost ordinary. Almost. There was a quality to them I can only describe as provisional, like a river after a flood, moving normal but with a new channel cut underneath that everyone can feel and nobody says anything about. I went about my work. Ernesto went about his. Nora went about hers. The town went about its own. But there was a watchfulness to it, not hostile exactly, more like the watchfulness of a man who has been told he's not going to be hit and is still waiting to see if that's true. I went to Nora that night. It was not my regular time, and she looked at me from the porch and read something in my face. She said, "How bad?" I said, "Not bad yet. Could get bad. I want you to tell me if anyone says anything to you, does anything, comes near you or the shop in a way that feels wrong." She said, "I'm not someone who imagines threats, Sheriff." I said, "I know that. I'm asking anyway." She said, "Wade." It was the first time she'd used my given name, and we both heard it at the same moment. She looked mildly surprised at herself, and I looked at the porch boards. She said quietly, "I've lived a long time in places where I was not what was wanted. I know how to take care of myself. I'm not asking you to stop. I don't want you to stop, but I need you to know that I'm not fragile." I said, "I know you're not." She said, "Then stop looking at me like you're afraid I might break." I looked up at her. I said, "I'm not afraid of that. I'm afraid of the men who think you should." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, and I went back to the jailhouse, and I sat at my desk, and I wrote a letter to the territorial judge explaining the situation in Garnet Creek, the petition, the barn, the ongoing nature of the disposition of certain residents, and requesting guidance on my legal authority in the event of civil unrest. I sent it with the morning stage. The morning stage also brought Nora's sister. I didn't know she had a sister. Her name was Brianna, and she was younger, darker-haired, and she'd come from Tucson because Nora had written her a letter that Nora told me later she'd kept deliberately calm and unworrying, which apparently had not been calm enough. Brianna Callahan. She'd kept her married name from a husband who died in a mining accident, was 4 months past that death, and she had arrived in Garnet Creek with 2 trunks and a very specific look in her eye. She came to the jailhouse to meet me on her second day in town, without Nora, which I thought was interesting. She sat across my desk and she looked at me the way you look at a wall to check if it's load-bearing. She said, "My sister says you're the reason she's still here, and not run off or worse." I said, "Your sister mostly kept herself here. I just removed some obstacles." Brianna said, "She also says you're not taking proper care of yourself. She says you work all hours and eat in that hotel where the food is terrible." I said the food is adequate. She said she worries about you. I didn't know what to do with that. I looked at the deputy's desk across the room, which was empty because Ernesto was out making his morning round. I said she shouldn't spend her concern on me. I'm fine. Brianna Callahan looked at me with an expression that reminded me powerfully of Nora, the same steadiness, the same quality of seeing through things, and she said, and got up and left. The letter from the territorial judge arrived 6 days later. It was direct and useful. My authority to arrest for criminal threatening, false imprisonment, and civil disturbance was confirmed, and the judge enclosed a formal notice, signed and stamped, which I was authorized to post, and which stated in legal language that any interference with any resident of Garnet Creek based on belief in curses, hexes, or supernatural influence would be prosecuted as a criminal matter. I posted it on the door of the sheriff's office and on the board outside the land office, and I sent Ernesto to nail one to the wall of the saloon. Amos Pratt came to read it. He stood in front of my office for a long time, and then he came in and sat down across from me, and he said, without looking at me directly, "Wade, I owe you an apology." I said, "You owe her one more than me." He said, "I know it." I said, "Go give it then." He did. He came back 2 days later and told me he'd gone. I didn't see it and I didn't ask to. Some things a man has to do in the right room with the right witnesses, and the one it was owed to is the witness that counts. But she came by the office that evening and she said, "Amos Pratt stood in Millie's shop this afternoon and said he'd been wrong, in front of Millie and Constance Pratt and 2 customers, and then he left." I said, "How'd it land?" She said Constance cried, which I wasn't expecting. Millie looked like she'd been holding her breath for a month. She paused. She said, "It doesn't fix everything." I said, "No." She said, "But it's something." I said, "It's the start of something." She looked at me. The evening light was coming through the window at that particular western angle that makes everything look like the end of something, which it wasn't. She was wearing a dark blue dress I hadn't seen before, and her hair was down, which it usually wasn't, and I noticed it the way you notice a thing that you've been not letting yourself notice. She said, "Will you walk me home?" I said, "It's still light." She said, "I know it is. I'm asking anyway." So I locked up the office and walked her back to Dorothea Will's house. We walked slow, the way you walk when you're not in a hurry to be somewhere, because the getting there is the thing. She talked about the letter from Cork she'd gotten that week, from her mother's cousin, and I talked about a mare I'd been thinking of buying because my current horse was getting old, and it was nothing, just talk, the ordinary stuff that fills the space between 2 people who have gotten used to each other's company. We got to the Wills' house and stood at the gate. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about staying practical, about getting tired of the anger." I said, "What about it?" She said, "I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I'm made that way. I get angry and I stay angry." I said, "It's not a virtue. It's just what's left after a long time. The anger burns through and something else is there." She said, "What's left?" I said, "I don't know. Determination, maybe. This idea that the thing has to be held together even when it's hard to hold." She was quiet for a moment. The evening birds were starting up somewhere in the cottonwoods behind the house, and the sky was that color it gets just before full dark blue, with the last of the gold still faint along the ridge. She said, "Brianna thinks I should tell you something." I said, "You don't have to tell me anything Brianna thinks." She said, "No, but she's usually right about things, which is irritating." She said I should tell you that I feel safer here than I've felt in years, and not because of the judge's letter or Amos Pratt's apology, and that you should probably know that. I looked at her. She was looking at the road. I said, "I'm glad." She said, "That's all you've got?" I said, I'm 53 years old, Nora. There hasn't been. She said, "I know how old you are, Wade. I'm 36. I've buried a husband and crossed half this country by myself and been locked in a barn by people who thought I was a witch. I'm not asking you to solve a problem. I'm just telling you a thing." The light was nearly gone. She still wasn't looking at me. I said, "I think about you. I do. More than I've thought about anyone in a long time. I go home to that office and I think about the conversation we just had, and I think about the next one." She turned and looked at me then. I said, "I don't know what to do with that. I'm better at the job than I am at anything else." She said, "Maybe the job doesn't have to be everything." I said, "Is it enough?" She blinked. She said, "What?" I said, "You asked me 3 weeks ago. You said, 'Is it enough?'" She remembered. I saw her remember it. She said quietly, "I was asking because I didn't think it should be, for you." We stood at the gate of Dorothea Will's house in the dark, and neither of us moved for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on my arm, just her hand on the sleeve of my jacket, not pressing, just resting there. And she looked at me with those green eyes that I'd first seen steady in a lantern-lit barn, and she said, "You kicked that door down. Nobody asked you to. Nobody expected you to. You just did it because it was the right thing to do, and you've been standing between me and the rest of it ever since, and you've never once made me feel like it was a burden or like I owed you anything for it. You know what kind of man that is." I said, "You mentioned something like that before, a useful kind." She said, "A rare kind." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'd like to know that kind of man better, if he's willing." I put my hand over hers where it rested on my arm, just held it there. She let me. I said, "I think he's willing." She smiled then, not a big thing, just a small, certain, real smile, and she went inside. The rest of it came slowly, the way good things mostly do. The town settled, not all at once and not without friction. There were a few more sideways looks. One woman at the milliner's who made a pointed comment about Nora's hair within earshot of 3 people, which Nora reported to me with dry amusement rather than distress. Clement Foote left Garnet Creek entirely by September, which nobody missed. Chester Rudd rebuilt his reputation slowly and painfully, the way a man has to when he said something he can't entirely unsay even after he stopped believing it. He came to me one afternoon in August and stood in the doorway of my office with his hat in his hands and said, "Wade, I want you to know I was wrong about what I said and about what I let happen." I told him I appreciated him saying it. He said, "I don't suppose it's enough." I said, "It's the start of enough." What I've never been able to fully put words to is what changed in me in those months. Something had been set in a particular position for a long time, a way I held myself, a posture of being only the job and nothing outside it, and the events of that summer had shifted it without my permission. The barn, the petition, the padlock, Nora's voice in the dark, steady and unbroken, her hand on my arm at the gate in the evening. Something had moved that I hadn't thought was still capable of moving. I did not examine it closely. I've never been a man who does well examining his own interior. I preferred to watch the evidence of it, that I left the office at a decent hour now, that I ate better, that when Ernesto came to me in the morning I was already thinking past the day's business to the evening, that I'd started leaving the lamp on in the window of the jailhouse when I walked across town at night, which I'd never done before, so that if anyone needed me they could see I was close. Small things, but a different man was doing them. Dix never came back, which was what I'd counted on. Men who make that kind of noise in front of a crowd are generally looking for a crowd to make it in front of. Remove the crowd and they lose interest. And a town that has had its worst impulse checked and named, even if it doesn't apologize for it outright, even if it just goes quiet and settles into something more ordinary, tends to find its way back. People mostly want to be decent. They need someone to hold the line while they remember that. Brianna Callahan stayed. She took a room at the hotel for 2 weeks and then a room at the Wills house when Dorothea offered it, and then she was just there, part of the landscape, a fact of the town. She got work at the hotel doing laundry and accounts, and she was good at the accounts, and within 2 months she was running the hotel's books, which the owner, a man named Grafton, could not have been more relieved about. Brianna was also relentlessly cheerful about the situation between her sister and me, to the point of embarrassment, which Nora bore with the patience of a woman who'd spent a lifetime being embarrassed by a younger sibling. Nora and I did not move fast. We were not young people, and we had both been shaped by things that made fast moves feel reckless. I walked her home most evenings. We ate dinner together on Fridays at the hotel restaurant where the food was, admittedly, not good, and I paid, and she did not make a thing of it one way or the other. She came to the office sometimes in the afternoon with coffee, and we sat and talked. I fixed a hinge on Dorothea's back gate because it was bothering Nora to look at it crooked, and Nora made me a shirt because the ones I owned were past their useful life. A deep gray shirt that fit better than anything I'd owned in years, and I wore it and she noticed, and neither of us said anything particular about it. November came and the cold. I remember one morning that month, early, ice on the water trough and the sky the color of tin. I came out of the office at first light and Nora was there, coming along the street from Dorothea's, a shawl over her shoulders and her breath making small clouds. She'd gotten up early to bring me something, one of Dorothea's pies, an apple one, wrapped in a cloth, and she was going to leave it on my doorstep and she'd gotten caught being there. She stopped in the middle of the street. I was standing on the steps. The light was pale and cold and her hair in it was extraordinary, the deep red gone almost auburn in the winter morning. She said, "I was going to leave this and go before you were up." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I didn't know what to do with I just thought you should have it. A hot breakfast." I said, "Nora." She said, "What?" I said, "Come in out of the cold." She stood there a moment. Then she came up the steps and I held the door and she came inside and she put the pie on my desk. I found 2 tin cups that were tolerably clean and I poured the last of the night's coffee, which had been on the stove since before dawn and was past redemption, and she took a cup anyway and held it between her palms for the warmth. We sat across from each other in the early pale light and ate apple pie for breakfast, which I'd never done in my life, and which is the best kind of breakfast there is, it turns out. She had put a lattice top on it, careful small strips of dough woven over each other, and I thought about the patience that took, the waking up early to do it, the particular kind of thoughtfulness that shows up in doing rather than saying. That was Nora in one image if I had to pick one. Not grand gestures. Just a pie on a cold morning, brought to a man she thought might not be feeding himself properly, carried in both hands through the mud and ice of a November street at sunrise. I ate 2 pieces and didn't say much and she didn't either, which was its own kind of conversation. She said, "I've been thinking about whether to stay." I said, "In Garnet Creek?" She said, "Yes, I move. It's what I've always done. Something gets hard and I move. It's easier than staying." I said, "What's different this time?" She looked at the pie. I said, "If it's me, I don't want you to stay because of me. I don't want to be the reason you're somewhere. I want to be a reason if I get to be one. But you'd have to actually want to be here." She said, "I want to be here. This is the first place I've wanted to be in a long time. You are a reason, but you're right, you're not the whole reason." I said, "Then stay." She said, "All right." That was November. By January, she had moved out of Dorothea's and taken the two-room house on Packer Street that had been empty since the Lyle family left for California, and she was paying the rent herself, which she insisted on, and she had her sewing things set up in the front room and her own life set up the way she wanted it, which was exactly as it should be. I was at that house most evenings, sitting at her kitchen table or on the narrow porch when the weather allowed. We talked more than we didn't, and when we didn't talk it was the easy kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. She read to me sometimes. She had books, more books than I'd expected, carried in that one trunk all the way from Cork to the Arizona Territory, Dickens and Trollope and some Irish poet whose name I couldn't pronounce. I fell asleep in her kitchen chair one night and woke up to find she'd put a blanket over me and left a lamp burning low and gone to bed herself. And I sat there in the lamp quiet, and I thought about the shape of my life for 11 years and the shape of it now, which were so different from each other that I could barely hold both of them in my head at the same time. There were nights in the deep cold of January and February when I didn't leave until late, later than was probably proper by the town's accounting, and I no longer cared much what the town's accounting was on that or anything else. We'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner. She cooked, plainly and well, nothing fancy, the way a person cooks who learned to do it with limited means and not much time, and she'd have her mending or her pattern work spread out while I read through the week's territorial papers, and the stove would knock and settle, and the cold outside would press against the window glass, and the lamp would put a warm circle around us that felt like the most civilized thing I'd been inside in years. She asked me once in February whether I'd ever thought about leaving. The badge, the town, all of it, whether there'd been a moment when I'd thought about writing out and finding something else. I said once, maybe twice. She said, "What stopped you?" I said, "The job stops you, not because it traps you exactly, because it becomes the thing you're responsible for, and walking away means something about you that you don't want to be true." She said, "That sounds like a cage with the door open." I said, "Maybe, but I chose to stay in it. That's different from not being able to leave." She put down what she was stitching and looked at me directly. She said, "Wade, do you want to be here?" I said, "I want to be in this kitchen." She held my gaze a moment. Then she picked up her needle again and she said, "That's a good answer," and went back to her work. I stayed another hour. The cold didn't bother me on the walk back. Spring came late that year. The snow held on into March, which was unusual. The morning it finally broke, the air changed overnight. You could feel it. That particular loosening that comes when the cold lets go. I walked out of the office at sunrise, and I saw Nora coming up the street in a coat she was already clearly too warm for, and she had her face tipped up to the sky in a specific way, eyes half closed, taking in the warmth, like a woman who'd been cold a long time. She heard me and looked over. She smiled. I walked across the street to her. The mud was deep from the melt, and I offered her my arm to cross the worst of it, and she took it, and she kept it when we got to the other side. I said, "Warm enough?" She said, "Not yet, but getting there." She was looking at the street, the morning light on the buildings, the couple of horses tied outside the saloon. The town in the spring morning, ordinary and imperfect and mine in the way things are yours when you've given your years to them. She said, "It's a decent town, Wade, under everything." I said, "It is." She said, "I think it's going to be all right." I looked at her. The early sun on her hair, that red copper color, the freckles across the nose, her hand in the crook of my arm, solid and warm, the hand of a woman who'd crossed an ocean and a continent and a barn door locked by fools, and who had chosen to stay here beside me on this muddy street in the Arizona Territory on the first warm morning of a late spring. I said, "I think you're right." The mud dried out by afternoon. The horses were watered and the stage came through and Ernesto made his rounds and the land office opened its doors, and everything proceeded the way it does when a town is getting on with its life. I made my own rounds, nodded to the people I'd made my peace with, kept an eye on the ones I hadn't quite, ate lunch at the hotel where the food was bad. That evening I sat on Nora's porch, the two of us side by side in the chairs she'd gotten from Dorothea, the town going quiet around us, lamplight beginning to show in windows down the street. She had her hands around a cup of tea, and she was watching a hawk work the updraft above the ridge to the east. I had given 11 years to Garnet Creek. I would probably give 11 more. That was all right. That was the job, and the job still meant something, and I was still the man who could do it. But I was no longer only that man. I was also the man on this porch in the warm dark, beside this woman who had looked at me in a lantern-lit barn with steady green eyes and decided I was worth trusting, and who looked at me that same way still. The hawk caught the thermal and rose without effort, higher and higher until it was just a speck against the pale sky, and then it wasn't even that. Nora said quietly, without looking away from the ridge, "Stay a while." I said, "I'm not going anywhere." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the stars that were beginning to show, and I looked at them too, and the night settled in around us like it had somewhere to be.